Now, I'm in a state of a bit of depression at the moment because I'm a grandfather, and last Christmas we had the family together and we went into breakfast one morning where we were joining with the family. They were already there at the table. And as we went in, the grandkids got up, sprang up, and they ran out, to greet us. I thought that greet us, and then they ran past me and they said, "Nana, Nana, Nana." And I stood there going, "Hey." And the reason I'm depressed, I've got over that. It was last Christmas, But the reason I'm depressed is that a very good friend of mine said to me, he said, "I'm going along to the talk that or conference that you're speaking at next week." And I said, "Oh, that's great." He said, "Yes." He said, "I'd walk 1,000,000 miles to see Angela Shanahan." I thought, but I'll probably get over it. Well, it's certainly the case we know, and I'm talking obviously on security's dependence on truth. And of course we've heard so much today, and we can't turn on our television sets or look at the nightly news or read the newspaper and not be aware that our world is a world in conflict. And we've heard from Elizabeth, of course, so much about that as well. We see it in Africa and the conflict between peoples groups, between nations in places like North Africa and the Middle East. And then we have Iran with very much a major influence on instability in places like Lebanon, the West Bank, Iraq, the Straits of Hormuz, and the Yemen. In Asia, I think it would be true to say that the whole of Asia lives in fear of China and its ambitions, and even in Europe, a place where we would expect stability to have been born years ago. The fact is that we actually have an ongoing war between the Ukraine and Russia. And while, of course, adding to our own sense of insecurity, or adding to our own sense of insecurity, we have, in addition, a real concern nationally for the actions of China in the South China Sea. Such brazen actions, and then, of course, about its cyber espionage and commercial international property theft. And if all those examples of national security problems are not enough, then of course we have also at a sub-national level, below that, problems for individuals, right? And I'm not going to run through those because I think we've been given that in real detail this morning by Elizabeth. But it's there. It seems when we look at the size of the scope of the problem that perhaps what we need is an atom bomb as a weapon, not truth. But I'm going to try to convince you that that's not the case, that truth has a real role to play here, and I hope a major role to play, and is really important if we're after long-term solutions to the insecurities that we have at the moment. To do that, I'll look first at what security is. I'll then go through a number of issues that impact on security and look at how truth might be relevant to them. Remember, when I'm speaking about truth throughout this, that I'm speaking in both a secular sense of truth, fact, but also I'll bring out gospel truth or biblical truth as well from time to time. Now, what is security? Well, in the very simple days in which I was in the military, security was pretty easy national security was pretty easy to define. It was simply stated as the lack of war, or the absence of war, or the absence of conflict. But it's since been accepted as much more than that. Security is no longer just a matter of who has the biggest army or who has the biggest economy, but goes beyond that to include the concept of not just territorial security or national security, but also personal security. The two are very much linked, of course. But I'd hazard a guess and say that most of the individual cases of security, of persecution of Christians that the CFF deals with are unlikely on the whole to be the direct result of war between countries. They may be an indirect product of those. Instead, they are an aspect of personal security, right? Separate from national security. Now, increasingly too, it's important to realise that security will be affected in the future by whatever our belief about global warming is, the resultant changes that might occur if the globe does warm. Changes in the amount of arable land that's available, particularly in poorer countries, and by growing demands on basic resources, such as, or including food and water, as populations just grow. If you have no food or water and the fellow next door has loads of it, and it just so happens that the water he's got is because he's getting it from a river that eventually runs down to you, but he's taking all your water, you might just find if you're in that bloke's situation, you'd go to war over it. And in fact, your very family's security, right, in future might depend on your going to war over it. So threats to personal security, individual security, are going to expand, grow. So what are the threats to security then? Well, it's a bit difficult to collapse all these threats from all around the world, security threats all around the world, into a useful list for us to talk to today without me going right through till tea time, which I'm sure you don't want. So I've attempted to look at what generically are some of the threats to security. I'll say here I've left out one of the major ones, very relevant to this group, because I knew it was going to be covered and has been, and that is ideology or faith. Right? Ideology or faith. I've left that out because I think Elizabeth and our other speakers have covered that more than adequately. So I've got a list of 7 remaining, and what I'll do is I'll go through each of those and talk to them now. I should have worked out how to use this before I came up, of course. Well, the first one is evil. Because we believe as Christians that the reason that evil is present is because Christ is absent, it's very hard to take just one derivative of Christianity, that is truth, and have it stand alone as a solution to it all. I think it's also difficult sometimes for people who may not have seen evil in this way to fully understand or conceive raw evil. I was briefly in Rwanda immediately after the genocide ended. And in driving through refugee camps there, which contained, of course, not only refugees from the genocide, but also the perpetrators of the genocide who were hiding in the refugee camps, I certainly came face to face with raw evil. I will never forget the faces that I saw in there, that I could tell you without having to interview them at all, that they were the perpetrators of the genocide. You could see evil deep in their faces in a way that I've never seen it before. This level of evil is there, of course, in conflicts around the world, particularly internal ones involving minorities. Historically, internal conflicts have always been the greatest levels of inhumanity on a personal level. So I would have to say that we cannot hope the secular truth of its own can mediate the effect of pure evil on national and personal security. Only a Christ-changing presence in the people can do that. This is a role for the church, a role for its missionaries well before the conflict erupts. People dedicated to drive out in the name of Christ witchcraft and all the other vestiges of Satan which exist in these places, and certainly did in Rwanda. Hopefully then, truth might be a concept understood and able to influence the character of society so it prevents conflict, but the nature of that conflict if it fails to do so. Next is competition. As you look at the current tensions between the United States and China, there can be little doubt that we're seeing the outcome of a global competition, or a competition for global supremacy. A competition to be, at least in status, the top dog. This is a source of conflict, or has been a source of conflict throughout history. A large part of the cause for World War I was the fact that those nations who had actually become nations during the mid-1800s or had never been maritime nations and therefore didn't have the colonial empires that Britain, Holland, Belgium and France certainly did at those times, that those nations missed out on a certain source of economic power, of economic wealth. And they wanted to defeat those countries that had it, particularly Britain, and to acquire some of that wealth to themselves. And again in the Second World War, it was the same competition that was part of the motivation for Japan. Although it had been a maritime country, because it had been closed for so many years, it was part of the motivation for Japan to act aggressively as it did in World War II. Now again, only Christ can mediate the competitive motivations and jealousies between countries. But there is a role, and I say this as a real critic of the United Nations, but there is a role for the United Nations and various global trading organisations that seek to establish a more even playing field and reduce the amount of enmity in the competition between the players there. For instance, to create rules of competition so each is given more confidence in the way the other will operate. It opens each country up to a degree of transparency, demands more consistent ethic in the ways that the global market operates, for instance. Now, it's a bit obtuse, but I think fairly a role for truth in reducing tensions because it increases transparency. The next one is crime. Now, hopefully you won't be surprised to see crime listed as an issue that's attacking security globally. You might be thinking it's just about personal security, but it also attacks the security of nations, particularly developing nations. And not only through the cyber criminals we see causing more and more havoc. Most people, here I know in particular, are well aware of people trading across borders, or trafficking across borders, and also about the sex trade and the global drug trade. In order to make their profits, so many of these organisations have brought off the leaders of countries in which they base their trade. They corrupt not only the people, in the case of drug trade, who they sell the drugs to, but they also corrupt whole nations and have control and sway over parliaments and government institutions. The result is criminal organisations protected by a web of lies and corruption, by people in police forces abrogating their responsibilities and sworn loyalties, and by parliamentarians serving themselves instead of the people. They make their profits anywhere they can, and even from parents who are wrongly convinced that it's okay for their daughters to go into sexual bondage if the price paid for them means a better life for the family. Truth finds very hard going against entrenched criminal gangs, particularly where they have bought off most of the police force. To expose criminals or their activities in these circumstances is all but surely to invite your death or the death or worse of a family member. But truth can prevail, and we must persevere. More important, we must encourage people of truth in these countries. We must try by every method we can to grow people whose value on truth is so high that they will ultimately win against these criminals and their organisations in places like Mexico and Colombia and other parts of the world. One way of doing this is by government training and aid specifically aimed against corruption and to breed truth. Years ago I was involved in counter-terrorist training up throughout Asia. And when some of the lefty journalists got hold of the fact that SAS was training all these armies around Asia in counter-terrorism, they went berserk, because here we were training the special forces in these countries who, as far as they saw it, were the people creating all the problems in these countries, killing people. Well, let me tell you, they had it wrong, and they had it wrong for this reason. That you don't have to train someone to shoot a weapon. If he's got a weapon, he can work out how to shoot it. And if he wants to actually terrify people, he can do it. But what that training did was it brought notions that were completely foreign at that time, in the 80s and 90s, completely foreign at that time to these defence forces. Notions of minimum force. Notions of a proportional response. The very act of negotiating. Some of these countries had what were essentially caste systems. And those caste systems meant that a police commander wouldn't even talk to a terrorist because he was so low down the caste level. We had one incident where a real disaster had occurred when the local country had terminated an incident on an aircraft or got someone else to do it. And sure, they killed all the terrorists, but they killed half the passengers. And when they, after our training and bring police negotiators up to teach them what negotiation was about, after doing that, when they had the next incident, lo and behold, the police commander himself exchanged himself, right, with the hostages and allowed the terrorists, or with the terrorists, was flown out of the country, and then the terrorists let him go. What a change in result, right? So we can change the way people act, right? And we can change that because the way you and I act, the way that our country approaches problems like this, you know, of minimum force, with principles of minimum force and proportional response, and trying to negotiate our way out. These are deeply rooted in the fact that as Christians, as a Christian country, we identify that we're all part of God's humanity. Right? And so we can take those things into these countries where crime is a problem, and we can encourage people in truth. Right? And over the long term, and it'll take the long term, things can change. The next one is poverty and want. There can be no doubt that poverty and want are major causes of insecurity around the world, and one set to grow in importance if the globe warms as predicted. Poverty, of course, attacks individual security directly. There can be no sharper cause of instability than hunger. Your own vulnerabilities to exploitation by those who hold power and money is greatly increased. But even more, the vulnerability of the whole community to instability is greater. It's very difficult, there's no doubt, to fully empathise with the situation of people in extreme poverty. It's so far out of our experience, out of our daily thoughts, unless CNN suddenly gets in there and highlights it all. But it simply means the onus is reversed. Our responsibility to truth is to make sure, and Karen talked about this earlier with regard to individual people persecuted, our responsibility is to make sure that our governments and their communities fully realise the scope of this tragedy. We have to get the truth out to the decision makers about poverty, in the same way we need to do about persecution. I know many people here will be donors to different organisations that attempt to alleviate poverty around the world, but we also have to go this further step. We have to represent these issues, these truths, into our parliaments. Advocate for a large proportion of the budget, or a larger proportion, to be given in aid for us to meet the Millennium Development Goal. I'm personally very disappointed, and have been for years, because we haven't been able to get governments to change it, to see that we are 15th or 16th in the world as donors in percentage of our gross national income. It's about the only thing, I think, that we're not worried about the Poms beating us at. You know? Quite apart from the moral imperative to improve the lot of people caught in poverty, which must be our major concern, it is the fact, I think, that we greatly underestimate what is a destabilising effect this will be on the world as global communication increases. As a mobile phone, for instance, is pushed down to poorer and poorer people. I remember being in the Middle East and up on the Golan Heights, and there were a lot of Bedouins who were up there. And I used to go in and have cheese with them and all this sort of stuff. And talking with these fellows, their view of Australia was, they said, well, of course, Australia's a big desert. And you all live on the fringes of it. And their view of us and how we lived was quite a modest life, right? Probably comparing it with their own, or visualising it to be like their own, same level of wealth. Now, I didn't try to disavow them of that, I must say, and it was because of a deeply held sense of guilt that my actual living standards were so much higher than theirs. But the reality is now that if you look at the TV at night, you look at the coverage of even some of these refugee camps, you'll see that even apparently really poor young people running around with mobiles. And they know how we live. The secret's out. And if that doesn't drive envy, right, and shouldn't drive envy, I'd be very, very surprised. We've seen this already in the exodus of people from, and most of them, or a lot of them, economic refugees into Europe. I don't believe we can expect this to stop unless we address the relative lack of opportunity and hope that's in these countries, in Africa in particular. I believe too that we have seen in recent attacks of on the Saudi oil fields how cheap it has now become for potentially even poorly funded militias to use drones in devastating attacks. Now, this particular attack was almost certainly from Iran, no matter how much it denies it. But I've no doubt drones will become the weapon of choice for the future of these groups. And why wouldn't they, when driven by what in reality is an obscene level of inequality between the way they live and the way we live? Without doubt, our security, your personal security and our national security will rely in the longer term on how well we cause our countries and peoples to respond to this inequality that we have in wealth right around the world. How well we bring this to the public square and demand it be better rectified. Surely this is the business of Christians and churches. It is highlighting to a nation that wants to ignore it, that the truth of that inequality. Next is historic enmities. This, like poverty, is a problem for which we as Australians remain, or of which we as Australians remain very ignorant. Unless we have personal family history that links us to places like the Balkans or to the Middle East or Northern Ireland, or those parts of Asia like Japan and Korea where you have these problems, we find it very hard to appreciate the depth and intensity of some historic enmities. In some cases, like Northern Ireland or the Balkans, the issues go back to some ancient battle. In others, they are the result of badly drawn boundaries by colonial powers. And nearly all have a long history of bloodshed and internecine fighting. I would be drawing a long bow to claim truth as an answer here when everybody's truth is different. But I had an experience of one of those on one of those very indulgent long cruises in Japanese waters earlier this year, which I think holds part of the answer. My father had fought throughout World War II in North Africa and again in the Pacific, including in Papua New Guinea against the Japanese. His particular unit had been at Milne Bay, where they inflicted Japan's first defeat on land. During that battle, they had seen the militia, what we today would call the reserve units, overrun, and many of the men in that unit taken captive. The battle was fought overnight, and Dad said that all night they heard the screams of these fellows as they were tortured to death by the Japanese. In the morning, they attacked the Japanese and drove them out. And then they saw the way these people had died. And Dad certainly held, I'd have to say, a hatred. He wasn't a Christian, great man, but not a Christian. Dad certainly held a hatred towards the Japanese right through to the age of 97 when he died. A feeling he didn't have towards the Italians or Germans he fought in North Africa who had not conducted themselves in that way. Now, our cruise ship visited Japan, and we found the Japanese people extremely nice, very courteous. And I couldn't help but think what a shame it was, that my dad and the diggers who felt the same way, understandably felt the same way, hadn't been able to meet Japanese people on the same terms that I was meeting them, right? And form a different opinion. Certainly my experience as a UN observer in Syria and Lebanon confirmed this truth. I was required to negotiate and socialise with all sides of the conflicts, and it never failed to impress me that while fierce combatants, they were always friendly to us, and I could always see the things in them that I was sure would recommend them to each other. You see, this is an essential factor to reducing tension, even deep historical tensions between people. It won't happen overnight, of course, but it is a simple truth again, that a truth that we are all humans. We are all in God's image, right? A biblical truth. Right? And as Christians, this is the truth we should carry with us and advocate for to any place where these enmities exist. Next, propaganda. Now, it's an unfortunate truth that propaganda is prevalent on both sides of any conflict. The truism that the first casualty of war is truth is a reality. Unfortunately, though, the reality is also that we are very quick to identify the opposition's propaganda, but very slow, if at all, to recognise ours. We can adopt an automatic bias as a result, which stops us from actually seeing the facts of a situation, and particularly the facts of a national or individual security emergency where emotions are running so high. But emotions not checked are sure to blind truth. Some people here will no doubt find it hard to accept what I'm about to say. But what I'm saying is the product of experience on the ground, and many reports I've received since indicate that it's still the case. I went to the Middle East very much an avid supporter of Israel, believing absolutely in its right to defend itself in the two Arab-Israeli wars in particular, and I still do. More than that, I absolutely believed and still believe, of course, that they are God's chosen people. But what I experienced in the Middle East left me in no doubt as to why God had found them also a stiff-necked people. I could not endorse all that they did, a lot of what they did. My first tour of duty was on the Golan Heights in an observation post where our job, pretty boring, was to investigate and report on any violations of the ceasefire agreement between Syria and Israel. Now, we arrived in Jerusalem. My wife was there with me. Great war. And after spending just a short time in Jerusalem, we shot over to Damascus, found a place to live, and then I shot almost immediately up for a tour on the Golan Heights. And everything that we've been seeing in all our press was very pro-Israeli, to the point that Israelis can do no wrong. But I found things quite different. On my first observation post up there, we look over an area which is an area of separation between the two armies. And of course the actual way that, or the number of tanks and artillery pieces and things like this that the armies can have in there are restricted. But the Syrian shepherds were allowed to actually go and feed their flocks in there like they always had traditionally. But to my great amazement, Israeli soldiers just opened up with machine guns on these flocks. Now this wasn't what I understood at all, was the way Israelis acted. I went back to Damascus, I told my wife this, I was really angry, and she said, "These are God's people." I bashed myself around the head and I went back up, and I had similar instances all over again. My next posting was to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, it actually was worse. In Lebanon, there were all these Palestinian refugee camps, and the Israelis would just fire indiscriminately artillery into these refugee camps. This is well before precision-guided munitions. It wasn't like you could hit, a terrorist in those days. And so whenever shells and bombs went into these refugee camps, people died. If you fire into these places indiscriminately and they're all packed with people, then people die indiscriminately. And we had to go and report on it. And one of the saddest consequences of all this to me was that, and I'm there working for peace, was that if you want to guarantee you have enemies forever, then just create the next generation of terror by firing indiscriminately into refugee camps. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because if we hope to reduce general instability in the world, and we must investigate, then we must investigate both sides of incidents, both sides of the story and conflicts with the same standard of truth as observers and critics. Doesn't mean we're any less supportive of Israel or Jews as God's chosen people, but we must apply the same standard of truth. In the same way, we must be sure, because of its influence on security, in the character and trustworthiness of those we lend our support to as we put them in power. The integrity of our democracy and its actions depend on our considered, and in the case of we as Christians, prayerful consideration of who we put in power. I'm very grateful for a lot of things that Donald Trump has done, particularly around abortion. But I would never recommend him for election to a Christian constituency on the basis he was a Christian. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to see in his character the character required of someone who follows Christ. We can have sympathies for one side or the other, or one person or the other. But if we are people who want to resolve security problems for the long term and not create new ones, as is happening in northern Syria at the moment, we must never stop seeking the truth in situations and looking for it or its absence in people of power. Miscalculation, the last one. I'm only going to deal with this one relatively quickly. It's an important element of security, and in particular, of course, global security. And it's really around confidence, which is very important for both sides to have confidence in securing security. During the Cold War, it was the confidence in both sides that neither was likely to miscalculate, that there were rational minds on both sides that kept the world safe, despite the overwhelming number of nuclear weapons, much more than today, that were there on both sides. In today's world, we don't have that confidence, due in part to the proliferation of nuclear weapons into the hands of irrational players. And in one case, perhaps we could say at the moment, as a result of an election. In the future, all these players will want to become or want to have confidence in what's happening on the other side. They will, of course, do this mainly by intelligence collecting themselves, although the smaller players will not be able to do that as effectively as the bigger ones, and that itself will create dangers. Despite what we may, all of us, think of as a not too effective United Nations, I really encourage you that they will probably need to play a bigger role in ground truthing, in inspections that give each side the confidence that the other is not about to initiate attack, to act preemptively. It's important truthing that they both need to know. Paradoxically enough, some of the most untruthful leaders in the world will be wanting to know the truth of the other side's intentions and capabilities. So in conclusion, truth is an absolute priority for security, a foundation for it. For personal security, it is our willingness to represent the case of persecuted or poverty-stricken people truthfully to power, to cause them, in the face of truth, to act. For national security is holding power to truth in its assumptions and actions, while all the time guarding our own personal commitment to truth. This week I see that the Christian author Frank Reed says in a recent book, and I'm not just trying to do a dump on Trump, as I said, I appreciate a lot he's done, but I see that Reed says in a recent book that Christians have a moral obligation to enthusiastically back Trump. Christians have a moral responsibility or obligation to seek truth. If we're always known for that, we will become trusted commentators on all issues, including security issues. We'll importantly create a confidence in Christians that will see more people into leadership positions in the nation who will bring Christ in, as Scott Morrison is certainly doing today. Thanks a lot. God bless you.